Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth in our series of Chebacco Chats. We're expecting to be joined in a moment by Erick Schenkel, but for now we have Daniel Shenkel. They're a father and son writing team who have thought about a question that maybe a lot of people have wondered about. And I'm going to take a moment here because now I see Erick Schenkel as an attendee. I am really hopeful that he can join us as a panelist. And we should have him on board in a moment. There you are, Erick. So good to see you.
Good to see you, Tim. I apologize for the technical difficulties.
Well, that's just part of the story, and I know all our listeners understand. Thanks for your patience, folks. We are talking about the Erick and Daniel's article in the new issue of Chebacco titled Owning the Dawnland, Shells and Maps, Misdeeds and Deeds. Erick is a Ph.D. historian who has written as an experienced historian and nonprofit administrator. Daniel is a nonprofit administrator in California. Both of them spend time on a farm in the northeastern part of Mount Desert Island. And they were presented with the question earlier this year of how exactly did their land become no longer Wabanaki land, but something that was owned and passed down by Euro-Americans. And I think the answer they came up with probably is widely something that we all can learn from, or all non-native people can learn from. So, and I want to begin to give you a flavor of what they've accomplished by asking, is it Daniel, were you going to read first?
Yeah.
Would you read us a selection from your article, Owning the Dawnland?
I'd love to, and I'll kind of start us at the beginning here. Our search began with two artifacts. The first was a yellowed hand-drawn map of Comfort Thomas Farm, the property on which our house stands. Comfort Thomas was the grandson of John Thomas, who settled on the northeast shore of the island in 1770, just 8 years after Abraham Sums settled in what we now call Sumsville. The second was a remnant of an ancient shell heap, pointed out to us by our neighbor. Its exact age is unknown to us, but it harkens back to the Wabanaki people who gathered clams, crabs, and mussels on this shore for many generations. Who lived here before us? Who owned this land before our family? What did their lives speak into our commemoration of the founding of Maine in 1820?
So you begin with that question, and I want to get to some illustrations we have here. And share the screen. I think you'll be able to see this now. So tell us, beginning with this map, you searched and right away found two artifacts that seem to frame your story. What were you looking for and what did you find? I think that's
really, we're just looking for any clue into the history of this place. We were fortunate enough to be able to, I say we because I act like it's mine, but our family was fortunate enough to be able to buy into a small part of the island. It's a place that we had been coming as a family for years, and we loved it. And as soon as we kind of had a place that we called ours, we wanted to know where it fit into the broader history of the island. I don't think it's unique to me or to growing up in New England, but I growing up felt kind of history was all around us. And so as we started coming up to the island, we felt similarly. And so when we started coming up, we would come up, we'd have fun, we would fish, we would canoe, hike, swim, but we also enjoyed walking through the cemeteries and noticing the names and hiking the carriage trails and going to the selectman's house and seeing the various exhibits that were there. So when we had a place, the first thing that I did, that we did, was kind of dig through to see where it fit. And so it really, as we kind of scurried through closets and drawers and running around the house looking for what there was to find that would allow us to know what it was that we had. So we found the map.
So your article focuses on two objects, the yellowed map of the Comfort Thomas farm.
Yeah.
And a shell midden. And somehow these framed your approach to answering this question. How did it do that?
Yeah, so the first way that we looked at it was that we found this map and knew the name Comfort Thomas. And so we both love history for its own sake, and love kind of digging into the research of things. And so I took that. We had some conversations with the neighbors to kind of get a frame of reference for how long they had owned the home, and dug back through trying to find anything that led to the name Thomas on the island. We found the map that everyone is looking at now, that kind of lays out where the Thomases first owned land from the de Gregoires. We were able to trace it back to the first kind of handoff of land from what was the state of Massachusetts to that family. It was sold to the Thomases, and we could trace that lineage. Hancock County does a great job of maintaining the records of deeds through time. But we also know that there was somebody that was there before the state of Massachusetts even could grant it to someone. The reality is that it came from someone to the state of Massachusetts, and then the state that's now Maine. And so the fascinating part of that was it's a very different set of resources, but we were pointed by one of the neighbors in our looking for kind of the European history. It's something that pulled us towards a history that isn't online at Hancock County, that's not traceable through the deeds. And that kind of started another side of the search. So we had, at the time, two kind of parallel tracks looking for two histories almost of the land.
And your search, when it came to that second history, before the settler history, brought you to a shell midden, and then you very quickly got to three characters that sort of shaped this story. Eric, you want to tell us who these three people are?
Sure. Well, the first is Joseph Treat, and this is a map that Joseph drew. He was a surveyor from Bangor and was commissioned by the governor of the new state of Maine to explore the unexplored wilderness. The European settlers knew very little about the rivers and woods and inland parts of Maine in 1820. And so Joseph Treat was chosen as the explorer to explore the new state of Maine, particularly in light of the fact that there was an uncertain northern border. The border was disputed with Britain, and that border dispute would not be settled for another, 22 years. And so the state had an interest to know who was living there, where were the good places to dam the rivers, what was the timber like, even a little bit of potential military interest as well, should they have to fight for the border in the north. So Treat was the explorer who did that search in 1820 in the months of late September through late November. The second figure is, of course, William King, the first governor of the state of Maine, who commissioned Treat to go on this trip. And King was one of the promoters of Maine statehood from Bath. He was a merchant, a ship owner. But he figures in our story particularly because it fell to him as the new governor to renew the treaties with the native peoples of our area which he did in the summer of 1820, finished up just a month before Treat's journey. And in this role, I think he comes across from newspaper accounts as a little bit uncertain, a little bit condescending, but he's trying to establish in the minds of this people who are very relational, not given to written documents, but to face-to-face encounter, that he's their new benefactor, that he calls them his children. And so in these treaty negotiations through the summer of 1820, there is a successful renewing of the treaties that the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot people had made with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, now renewed with the state of Maine. And then, of course, the third figure that we meet through this whole period of time is John Neptune, who's a legendary leader among the Wabanaki people, was Penobscot, called lieutenant governor by this period, but in the way that the Penobscot understood their polity, he would have been a co-equal leader. He held the position of leadership in the nation for 50 years, lived by some accounts to his 98th year, entertained Henry David Thoreau late in his life and became well known through Thoreau's writings and through the writings of another pioneer ethnographer, Fanny Ekstrom, who wrote a book about him and his life as a magician of sorts, a mythic figure who fought mythic battles. He was athletic. He was very, very well spoken. And so he represents the Penobscot nation in these treaty negotiations in the summer of 1820, and then is chosen by Joseph Treat as his guide in exploring the state of Maine, because it's the Wabanaki people who know the state of Maine. The Europeans don't know it at all. And so Penobscot, John Neptune becomes the Penobscot leader who transfers that knowledge to Treat and saves a lot of the Wabanaki place names and lure of that area through this 2-month trip that he makes with Treat. He and Treat had met during the treaty negotiations. Treat was fairly prominent in Bangor and sat in on negotiations, signs as a witness on the new treaty.
And Eric, so, you describe a statement or a confrontation between Neptune and King, the Wabanaki leader and the governor of the state of Maine. And you describe that as a snapshot of the conflict between people of the land and people of the shell heap. These
right.
Pieces of evidence that you're considering. What was that, the nature of that conflict?
Yeah, let me read that passage. Neptune's words on this first Wabanaki encounter with the state of Maine provide a snapshot of the conflict between the people of the map and the people of the shell heap. The settlers were rapidly building their economy, oblivious to the consequences, while the native people were struggling to continue the life they had known on the land for generations. So what are the particulars of the complaints that Neptune has to Governor King on this first encounter? Well, he complains that the river's being dammed by sawmills so that the fish aren't able to come up the river. Not only that, but the fishing practices of the settlers are such that they're using weirs to block the progress of the fish up the river. And by previous treaty agreement, the Penobscots are upriver and aren't able to fish any longer. In another encounter earlier, Neptune had complained about the hunting practices of the settlers. They didn't know how to think about sustainability. They killed everything in sight, whereas the Wabanaki had hunted every 3 years and killed 2/3 of the beaver, for example. And he complains about the timbering that's going on. The forests are being devastated by this onrush of settlement into Maine, in this period of time between, say, 1760 and 1820, when the number of European inhabitants grows from about 15,000 to close to 300,000. And so the land is being utilized in ways that, from the Wabanaki perspective, are brutal and not conducive with sustainability.
And how would you say Europeans and Wabanaki people differed in their concept of land ownership or land possession?
So the one of the things that was that we learned in the process, that the Wabanaki, and a lot of often what's presented is that the Native people kind of lived in this kind of naive, noble, unbounded utopia, and there wasn't an idea of land ownership. There, you can tell from the passage that that my dad just read, they understood the idea of settling boundaries with a treaty, and so Neptune comes with some negotiating points, but the ownership of land was much less tied to a European idea of ownership of land. So the European idea of ownership of land was very much started with the king, who was the ultimate owner of all of the land, and he would dole it out in very well-defined sections to people. And in exchange for having what we would call ownership, their obligation was to maximize the use of the land. And so as land wasn't being used maximally, as it wasn't being farmed or timbered, the timber wasn't being harvested, then the obligation of ownership wasn't being met well enough. And so ownership could be taken away. And so when that idea of ownership, not just being kind of the title to it, the holding of it, but also a responsibility to maximally improve it and send back whatever tax or fealty was due to the king, that land was seen as unowned. And so when the Europeans came to the New World and claimed vacant land, what they defined as vacant was land that hadn't been improved. And so where you have a native ownership that didn't depend on the improvement of the land, but rather often left the land as it was because the use was more for fishing and hunting, that was seen as unowned. And so the Europeans claimed large swaths of land that they said were vacant for their purposes, and claimed ownership for their kings, and their kings doled it out, and it was then kind of put to its maximally efficient use in European terms. So it was farmed, and it was the timber was cut, and the use wasn't just sustenance for the person that lived there, but so that the maximum could be extracted and then passed on to ultimately the state or the king that was the owner.
And then, Eric, I think you and I have talked about this, that the Wabanaki lived in relationship to the land, which is a little bit different than owning it. Can you touch on that?
Yes, this was one of the delightful things for me, was to get a better understanding of the way the Wabanaki thought about the land, not as something that you possess and utilize, but as something that you're a part of, have a relationship with. So that one Wabanaki, in appealing to proper use of the land, writes about the river to which I belong. And so the idea of geography, of locality, is something that you're a part of, not something you possess. And of course, European language is much different, is very precise, has to do with, as Dan said, utilization of the land. Land is a commodity in a ever widening market, and having utility that amounts to dollars and cents profit. So much different concept of the land. And if we had learned from the Wabanaki 200 years earlier, what we now understand about sustainability and care for the land, we would have been in a much better place in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Well, I think that all of us in producing this issue of Chebacco, which was titled Before 1820, knew that we had a lot to learn about the Wabanaki people. And as non-natives, I know we approached this with some trepidation, and you guys were bold and willing to be learners. And I wonder if you could touch on some of the things that were surprising to you, or mentors from the Wabanaki community that helped you come to a better understanding. Could you talk about that experience of trying to fairly and accurately represent this fraught situation? I know it must have been hard for you, and you must have been a little nervous about it, but you took it on. I appreciate that.
Well, we certainly came as learners and remain learners, and do recognize that we are in this exercise of commemoration wanting to listen to all of the voices of our past. And so we approached this as listeners, not as tellers, and had some wonderful guides, James Francis and Darren Ranko, two historians from the Penobscot Nation, were very helpful, were generous with their time and their advice in the early research I was doing on the Wabanaki people. Donald Soktoma of the Passamaquoddy people, I had a delightful encounter with him and some subsequent emails. He was very helpful as well. Then, of course, we have some great written resources by both Wabanaki people, such as Lisa Brooks, who's written on King Philip's War recently, Sherry Mitchell, who writes on what we as Europeans can learn from the wisdom of the Wabanaki, and written resources also by previous non-native peoples who have worked very well, Harold Prinz and Bunny McBride with their work on Estique's Island Domain for the National Park Service, and an article they did in Chebacco in 2011 on Estique's Fjord or Somes Sound on place naming and ownership. Some wonderful work that's been done. Then, of course, the work of Micah Pauling, who introduces us to Joseph Treat in his book about the Wabanaki homeland in the new state of Maine, which is a wonderfully edited edition of Treat's journal. So some wonderful new relationships, new bodies of literature, and I want to continue learning and continue friendship with these folks.
Great. So let me invite the audience to ask us questions. You can put a comment in our Facebook live stream, or if you're listening to us via Zoom, you can put a question there or on the chat column. We're interested in knowing what you're curious about or what your awareness is. And in the meantime, Daniel, you are. Tell us about the way you and your dad split up this writing task. How did you go about this? How did you assign this field where you kind of started out knowing almost nothing, right? That's not unfair to say. And you tackled this. How did you guys divide up the labor and pursue these questions?
So it's wonderful that so much now is online. A lot of the legwork in and around Maine and some into the archives in Boston was done by Pops down, my dad, while he was there. But a lot of the trying to build a bibliography and kind of figure out some of these sources, even primary sources that are available online. And so I kind of dug into building a lot of those sources out and doing a lot of the research. we put our best foot forward, and I think I deserve at best a co-writing credit, but I'll take an and Daniel Shenkel for a little bit more than I deserve. But we kind of each had different experiences with it and wrote out different sections of it that I think were able to be synthesized really well into a whole. And I shouldn't take a whole lot of credit. I think you and my dad deserve most of the credit for that synthesis and making it readable. But it really was fun to collaborate on a project like this.
Well, we had a lot of help, didn't we? We had a lot of reviewers and advisors. These drafts circulated quite a bit to try to get us in the right place. Now, Ron Beard has a question. He asks, what have you learned about Comfort Thomas's use of the land in his time?
Yeah, Ron, very little. Anything you can help us with, we would love to know. We're still continuing on this project. We know that the owner of our land after the Thomas family was Charles T. Howe, who was the real estate owner who bought much of the island and sold it to folks from the Northeast, who became kind of the second wave of those who fell in love with Mount Desert Island after the original settlers. But about the Thomas family, we've learned very little to date. So that can be a further project. Dan?
Yeah, to the best of our knowledge, it was a functioning farm. They farmed several fields. The way that the land is set out, they had cleared some of the forest and were farming, as far as we can tell, for their subsistence on the land, and in a couple of areas that are even now still kind of carved out, reserved from the forest itself for planting. We don't plant it, but maybe we ought to start.
And I know of some sources that we could pursue if we wanted to learn more about that. The tax records, I guess I'm not so familiar with the Bar Harbor tax records, but they will generally reveal how the land was taxed, whether it was used for pasture or planting or forest. And the 1860, that's after Comfort Thomas's time, but the 1860 agricultural census goes into great detail, and that's often one of the best sources for learning about 19th century. Now, Bill Horner asked a question: is our map from Peters? And the answer is yes to that. We have actually got with the help of the Bar Harbor Historical Society and their new storage and museum facility at La Rochelle, allowed us to photograph this map. And it probably is originally the Peters map from, I forget if it's 1792 or 1807. I get them mixed up, but it's very early, turn of the 19th century. But it was probably enhanced in the late 19th century. The nature of the illustration and penmanship doesn't suggest a 1700s or early 1800s penmanship. So yes, I think it's based on the Peters map.
Yeah, I should be quick to mention, Tim, that this is not the map, Bill, that we mentioned in our article. That map is a hand-drawn map from a much later period, and wasn't nearly as attractive or full of information as the Peters plan, so we used that as our illustration for the article.
And maybe our last question here, one you're not expecting. John Wilson asks on Facebook, talk about the wall cloth behind Erick.
Oh, well, the wall cloth is from Uzbekistan, where I lived for 10 years teaching at Tashkent State University of World Languages and working with the establishment of some young churches in the Republic of Uzbekistan. I taught comparative culture there and had a great time among the Uzbek people, and brought back some nice things.
Good question, John. Thank you. And you know, our time always goes so fast here, which is really the way we want it. And we really appreciate, Daniel and Eric, the time you put into this. I hope you didn't count the hours, but it took a lot of study, and I think your report is a great success. I want to thank all our viewers for joining us, whether you're able to join us live on Zoom or on Facebook Live or on a recording later. You can share this once we put it up on Facebook, and share it with people who you think might be interested. And come back next week, 4:30 on Thursday. We will interview Rachel Snell, who's written about a quilt that's in the possession of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and what it tells about the education of girls in the early 19th century. Again, thanks guys for being with us, and thanks to all of our viewers. Take care of each other. We'll see you next week.